before we get into the concept of self and narcissism, what role that plays in psychopathology, whether it is neurosis or some other form of psychopathology, is precisely that there are differences between a neurotic development, which is always an expression of psychological forces in conflict, and certain developmental lags. For example, somebody who doesn't develop a proper superego, right, and doesn't have the right kind of intellect to control the impulses and things of that kind, because the models that he had for identification were that type of a model. They did not have restrictions, and they were not empathic, and they were highly pathological and so on. Well, that's what they will introject. Now, these people then doesn't become neurotic of necessity. They may have some neurotic conflict, but essentially they don't have a superego structure. And as such, they very likely will have other kind of problems, which means they don't have a structure to control behavior. They don't have a structure to put reins on behaviors, and so they are going to get into trouble or create a lot of havoc in whatever social group they are, And that's different, you see. You can solve the issue of psychological forces in conflict, but to undo lags in development is a completely different issue, And more frequently than not, you may not be able to do it. Because these things, as you heard me say before, have critical periods, and if the critical period is gone, you may not be able to redress it. With some of these people, for example, you cannot put a new superego into them. The time for that has passed. What you can do, if they are bright enough, is to work with the ego brightness to show them that the style that they use is going to be detrimental to their best interest. And if they are bright enough, they may see that, and they may attempt to control the behavior on the basis of sheer human strengths, because they don't have superego to set goals, to set aims, to give them, ideas as to what is the best way to proceed in any particular situation. And there are many such things where what is happening is that there is some kind of deficiency. That's not a neurosis. Can be treated like a neurosis. That's not resolution of psychological forces in conflict. That's something different. These are structural lags. And some of them are not easily remediable, if they are remediable at all, And you have to make a very clear distinction of these things. And it's important. You see, in the past, it was not uncommon that they will refer people like that to a psychiatrist for medication. Well, what the hell are you going to medicate them with? You know what I mean? It was the society trying to get rid of the problem. I said, you take care of it. But how can you take care of something that didn't happen when it should have happened, and you have no means of going back in time and, restructuring the structure of the personality? So
distinguishing what is conflictual and what is deficit.
You can deal with things that are conflictual. You can be supportive of ego structures. You can reinforce the ego. You can deal with the superego insofar that it was formed out of situation of conflicts and identifications and so on, and they are there and they are harsh and all of that. You can deal with that. But if there is a lack of it because it was never acquired, there is no way you can put it in there. There is nothing you can do about that. Really, it's people have invented all kind of things, boot camps and this and that and the other, and it's all of it is a waste of time. But frankly, that's the truth.
Trouble for that time.
In any case, let's go to the concept of self and the idea of what is narcissism and what are narcissistic disorders, what is primary narcissism, what is secondary narcissism. All of this is of extraordinary importance because it affects frequently areas of the personality that lead to the so-called borderline character disorders, borderline disturbances, narcissistic type of character disorders, narcissistic type of disturbances, and things of that kind. And this, when they are based on some damage to the structure as they develop, some lags, then you have a different kind of problem. And it's a much more difficult kind of problem to deal with. It's not that it is impossible to do certain things that will improve these people a lot, but you are a lot more restricted in what you can do. That when what you have is a conflict situation, that develop into a neurotic resolution of symptoms, or even into a character structure that was resolved instead of with a neurosis, with a character development. Because some resolution of conflict don't lead to neurosis. They may lead to character structure. For example, you may have, instead of an obsessional neurosis, an obsessional character structure. And it's still the resolution of conflictual situations in a specific developmental stage. The type of resolution is different. But then by the same token, to deal with an obsessional character structure is a heck of a lot more difficult than with an obsessional neurosis, producing florid symptoms. And the reason is very simple. The obsessional character has no neurotic suffering. He thinks that you're wrong, that you are not meticulous enough, that you are not strict enough, that you are not organized enough, that you know this, not that, not the other. He doesn't see that his requirements are excessive, inappropriate, and drive everybody around them bananas. They think everybody about them is not doing the right thing, So they don't have motivation, They don't have motivation in the sense that they don't have neurotic suffering. Now, frequently, if they are bright enough, they may say, there is something wrong. It can be that everybody gets angry with me. I must be doing something for this. Then they go to somebody and say, look, I don't understand how it happens, but this is constantly happening to me, so I assume I'm doing something that is wrong and I can see it. Can you help me with it? And then you may take them into treatment, but it's not easy because you have to transform the character into a neurosis, and that's not easy to do.
Create conflict around
You bet. You have to undo that resolution, go to the symptom formation phase of it, and that is a problem. And it's never welcomed by the patients, incidentally, because they have a suffering and a kind of a stress that they were not used to. You see, the character disorder may be very useful. It might drive everybody else bananas, but they don't have any problem with it themselves, except that they end by realizing that something is substantially wrong because they can't hit it with anybody properly,
So it's the difference between ego dystonic and ego syntonic, where for the character...
Well, most character disorders are ego syntonic. Most character disorders, at least for a considerable amount of time. And of course, things that are egosyntonic, as you know, are a lot more difficult to deal with. If you can turn into egodystonic, which sometimes you can, but then you generally may be outside the realm of a strict analytic treatment. Because there are certain things that you may have to do that are active interventions that usually analysts don't get into that, But if you see that type of patient, that's what you do, And you modify your analytic technique and use your analytic knowledge, modify and adapt it to the requirements of that particular person. And so, there are people that does that. People like Kembe, for example. He's an analyst, and he uses his knowledge and adapts it to the requirements of some of these patients, But those things that many analysts occasionally may think, well, I don't do that, But they don't see that kind of patient, In any case, the concept of self is important. I assume you saw the lecture, right? So you are aware that the belief that we have, certainly that I have, because, people talk about self and narcissism and all of that, but there's not an awful lot written about the development of the self. Just sort of like people talk a lot about object relationship, but psychoanalysis doesn't have a theory of object relationships, bits and pieces of it, but not a comprehensive theory of it at all. Now, the concept of self is very complicated because I always start by saying, well, think that you are a newly born baby. What do you know about yourself? You just were born. What do you think you know about yourself?
Nothing.
Very little. Very, very little. And suddenly you are bombarded by a stimuli that you were not exposed to in utero because you are well protected by, the abdominal wall and the gut and the amniotic liquid and the utero and all of that. So it's relatively little stimuli that gets to you. Except for movement and the mother's heartbeat. That's obviously something that is very present. And as I always say, if you may well have heard that sometimes when you get a puppy, he gets very restless. What you do, you put a clock. That's tick-tock, by him, and he relaxes really tremendously, because he thinks he is in familiar environment. It seems.
We also have those toys for infants that makes the noise, the sounds of the womb.
Yeah, I know.
I had one, didn't work. It didn't. I don't think they quite recreated it.
It wasn't the right beat for you.
Right.
It'd be difficult to do that, I guess. But in any case, you have very little knowledge of yourself, and you have to build a concept of yourself, and that has two sides to it. It's a psychological self and a physical self. And your physical self takes a long time to build, just as your psychological self takes a long time to acquire a certain basic structure from which then you can develop a little bit, but you have to stay close to that basic structure that you have developed, but you can develop it a little bit. The physical self, part of the problem, which we have already, in a way, talked a little bit about it, is that we, among all mammals, are the most immature at birth of all the animals. And it takes longer for us to acquire the degree of maturity that most animals reach very quickly, in weeks. To give you an example, a foal that is born now, he can stand, but within an hour or two, he'll be standing and running faster than the mother. In other words, he is born totally uncoordinated and doesn't know how to use his legs, but obviously his brain is and his pyramidal ways are myelinized sufficiently so that once the mother gets him up, which she does very quickly because she wants to get him to the kitchen. That's the first thing the mother of the foal will do, get him up, so he goes and suck from her because the colostrum will save his life because he has all kind of antibodies that will protect him from all kind of things. A foal that doesn't do that is very likely to die very quickly. less so nowadays because there are all kind of resources that we have, in terms of antibiotics and so on. But in the past, they will die very quickly, and that's why nature has arranged it that way. Well, within 3 or 4 hours, he can run ahead of the mother, because the structure of the social structure of a horse organization is the foals run ahead, the mothers follow, and the stallion is behind. And they run. They don't like to fight. They run. That's a favored way of dealing with danger, is running away from it. The stallion only will stand if they get cornered and there's nothing he can do. Then he will turn around and fight. But otherwise he runs. He just runs behind the herd. And nature has arranged it so that the foal can run faster than anybody else in a matter of hours, literally. It takes a human being close to a year to be able to start walking. See the difference? It's an enormous difference. And myelinization goes, as I told you the other day, from the top of your head to the tip of your toes, and I explained to you how at the beginning you don't control your head, so wherever it falls, as you range of vision, whatever happens around you, they know a damn thing you can do about it. So you can build an image of your body self at that point that is accurate. You build an image at that point that is concordant with your maturity. But then as you mature, you have to modify it and add things to it, and functions and capacities that you didn't know you had until you are capable of performing them, And so a child, for example, which I told you is born with a closed fist and can open it at will, it takes 12 weeks for him to be able to do that, and then the hand becomes a tool and now can be used. So can the arm, at will to catch this, put in his mouth and things like that. Well, see, up to that point, he had a sensory sensitive kind of idea of his arm because he couldn't control it at will, so he didn't know. That was not part of the body scheme at all. That's added as it's developed, and so it goes with all the rest of the body. And it takes a year or more to get down to your legs and being able to walk and so on. And we talk about the difference that it makes when you can control your head and look around, and when you can see it, and how development is pyramidal and all of that. Well, now as you grow, you start to develop a concept of yourself, which is very, very primitive and gets more and more refined. At some point, is a reasonable, if not perfect, resemblance of what your body is like. But that takes at least 18 months. And the other problem that you have is that when you are born, you don't know the distinction between self and others. You have no idea that there is anything outside yourself. You just don't. So little bit by little bit, that has to develop at all. And just as you develop the self, you have to begin to differentiate between yourself and the rest. And that is done very gradually. It takes a long time. And it's very difficult to sort out the not self. Very difficult. Takes an enormous amount of time. It takes longer than the development of the self, act of a significant, valuable, primitive concept of the self. So at the very beginning, as you will imagine, the functioning and the things that the infant feels and the interactions with the environment are not seen as my mother is feeding me. He has no idea that there is a mother, or there is such a thing as food, or that he has a mouth. He has a sensory experience, which we call hunger. To him is a kind of homeostatic disequilibrium, and something comes, get into his mouth, flows, he likes it, and it calms his hunger, and that's it. You think he distinguished between himself and that? No, not at the beginning. At some point he will. And that is related to the concept of omnipotence and magic in the first year of life. Because what the child knows is that if he is hungry and he makes the kind of things that baby hungry make, which is noises, cry, randomly move, get blue on the face, and so on, and all of that produces a gestalt in the brain. It lights certain areas of the brain. It establishes certain paths that are related to this random movement and this feeling of distress and things of that kind. And then relief comes. He thinks he brings it about by doing this. That's magic, isn't it? It's like with gesture producing a miracle, or having somebody say, now you walk, and may walk. And of course, that has to be undone. You know, that flow, called that, at the beginning he says there is a pleasure ego that has to be substituted by a reality ego, okay? And so, in other words, what he's saying, whatever is pleasurable is part of the ego, whatever is unpleasurable in a primitive form is spit out. Something unpleasant in a baby's mouth, immediately, you know, and that has something to do with the mechanism of introjection and projection. These are the biological roots of such psychological mechanism. You know, is a more biological expression of similar mechanism.
That's also what Klein bases her theory on as well. Kleinians, they think about what's.
Well, the problem with Melanie Klein was this. She had no
idea of child development. No idea of child development. Or cognitive capacity.
No, she had her own idea of child development. What she didn't know was anything about the biology of the brain and brain development. And so she built a lot of theories more or less on the assumption that a baby's brain was an adult brain in miniature and capable of the same functions. And that's not the way it happens. If you could move some of the things that she said higher up, they will be more tenable, and some of them will be very good. But all in all, Kleinian theory has many problems, quite frankly. I know you got an earful the other day here, but we can discuss it one day. Don't take me wrong. Melanie Klein was I knew Melanie Klein, let me tell you. I was in England when Melanie Klein was alive, and I went to many of her lectures and many of his, I attended her continuous case seminar. And she was a very bright woman, but she was she just didn't have enough of a background to develop some of the theories that she was trying to develop. So she developed on the basis of a fantasies of what the brain was like, and that's what it is. She was an interesting woman, but a very controversial lady. Very controversial lady. Well, let's leave it at that for today. In any case, you have to make this distinction between self and object. That takes an enormous amount of time. And how you classify then the objects and how you acquire these concepts. It's important. We talk here in the first lecture of the importance of the child being stimulated, and the even more important part of that stimulation being consistent and provided by the one person rather than by 25 different persons. Because that'd be very confusing. What you can learn a lot better is there is consistency of the stimuli and the response, and you can make more sense. But if that changes constantly, it takes a lot longer to make sense of it. in any case, we talk about the problem of, object consciency vis-a-vis the concept of need satisfying. You remember that? And that it takes quite a long time to achieve object consciency. You have to be at least 14 months old for the most part. And before that, the object is exchangeable, particularly up to the 5th or 6th months of life. You can change the object, nothing happens really, nor does it leave any significant visible consequences later on in life, assuming that you have a good replacement for it. After that, yes, because the child is starting to develop the process of the attachment, and so as you remember, I told you it takes anywhere up to 14 months of certain type of interactions in sufficient numbers during the 24 hours of the day and the evening. In contrast to what I told you about the Gibbs and Lawrence, that it happens, whatever move in the field of vision at the moment of hatching, that's mother goose, and that's what you follow. That's not true of human beings. It takes a long time. Much of that is due to the fact of the immaturity of the brain. And we are not wired for a stimuli response, except with some primitive reflexes that we have early on in life. But then later on, we don't function that way at all. I mean, we need to learn everything that we do in order to survive in the world, and in order to learn, we need to have somebody to teach us. And so it goes. So as you see, it's a very complicated process. It's not easy. It takes a long time. And depending on your innate givens, your genetics, your environmental experiences, the amount of stimulation that you receive, then that blueprint which you were born will reach its ideal potential or not, or will fall behind a little or a great deal. As I told you then, the difference may not be very visible at the beginning, but maybe later on the difference between somebody with an IQ of 140 and somebody with an IQ of 80. And you still will walk and talk and have a job, but it's a completely different kind of situation, And the amount of information that is coming out nowadays in this area is awesome. I'm collecting it because I want to give a lecture and put it on the webpage, because it's really very interesting that we are finding the neurobiological basis of the things that we actually do. You probably pull it with your leg.
Yes.
It doesn't walk by itself.
Yeah, I'm engaging in magical thinking.
You thought you moved it, eh? In any case, the thing that I wanted to get into, particularly because we already discussed some of this earlier, and though it's perhaps not the most comprehensive way of dealing with it, you probably know for the purposes, but I want again to underline the fact that if things go well, then you would have built basic normal structures. And strictly speaking, more neurotic problems take place in people whose brain is reasonable, normal. They are not mentally retarded or damaged here or there in the other place, and they have all that kind of problems. And so, assuming that all of these go well, you develop the kind of structures that then can get into conflicts in terms of dealing with the world outside and how you gratify your human needs and what is allowable and not allowable in a given culture and a given structure of society and things of that kind. But let's go to the concept of narcissism. You see, at the beginning, as I told you, you have no concept of yourself. You have no image of yourself. You don't know who you are or what you are or what your map is like. You don't know you have ears and eyes and arms and legs. You don't know any of that.
I get confused here sometimes. Is that the same as saying that there's no difference between internal and external?
There is no difference at that point between internal and external, no, not necessarily. If an infant gets his mother's breast in his mouth, he, for a while, doesn't know that that is external to him. For a while, that's part of him. At some point, because he will learn that the magic doesn't bring the food, as we were talking about, omnipotence and magic, for a while he believes is what he does brings about the relief. He's not thinking that mother is coming with her breast to give him milk. He's thinking that he is magic, omnipotent, in inverted commas. You know, that'd be like a Kleinian idea. But it's not Kleinian because that's true. That's what the infant feels, that if he does this, relief comes. And that's true for the most part if he had a reasonable mother and a reasonable, respectable environment. Obviously, no mother is perfect, no environment is perfect. And many times it will happen that he will do his magic and relief doesn't come. So he will start to pay attention a little more to what the hell is going out there, that nothing is happening. And little bit by little bit, as his cognitive development increases, he will become aware that something from out there has to come. And if that something doesn't come, he can really bring about the magic of the relief, you know. And so it goes. So it takes time to make a distinction between the me and the not me, you know.
And that's
a child that sees something over there doesn't know that that's a wall. As far as he's concerned, that's part of him. That's what he sees. He doesn't have the means to say, that's a wall, I'm me, and that's not me. You know, all he experiences is me for a while, until he starts to develop more cognitive abilities. And in a variety of different ways, he starts to distinguish, let alone that. There are other ways that later on, as he matures, come into this. For example, if I touch you, you feel only one sensation, right? If I touch myself, I feel two sensations, one in my finger and one in wherever I touch, my arm. And that makes a distinction. You see, at some point, the child learns that when he has something in his mouth, he only has one sensation in his mouth. The other thing doesn't produce it. You start to learn, you know, it's gradually. The same is true with thinking. You see, children, for example, take a child that is, 15 months, maybe 16 months, and is starting to be verbal. And he goes out in the garden with his mother, and he sees an airplane going by, and he will say, birdie, 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 mommy, birdie, because the mother had shown him any number of birds. And look at the birdie, look at birdie. Well, at that point, anything that is suspended in the air, and particularly if it makes a noise, is a bird. Whether it is an airplane, a leaf falling, or a bird flying, you know. It doesn't distinguish. That's why I tell you, the acknowledgement or the knowledge of the not me or the world out there takes an enormous amount of time. Little bit by little bit, he will know that a bird is different from a leaf, and he will know what the difference consists of, and it's different from an airplane, and he will obviously realize that birds usually don't fly that high up, and they don't make that high noise. You know, all of these things he will start to differentiate. But at the beginning, these things are the same. Indeed, you get a boy grown in a city into the countryside. He sees a cow, and he says, "Mommy, doggy, doggy, doggy," because he has 4 legs and he's standing like a dog. Now, he will learn, you know, that that's not a dog. But he won't say, "Look, mommy, a cow." No, he will relate it to what is known to him, you know. And so you have to start to distinguish and differentiate these things. So it's a complex process. In any case, going back to where I wanted to go, Freud described, and this is Freud, a phase of autoerotism, which is characterized by autoerotic activities, which means you gratify yourself in your own body. And during that phase, that's at the very beginning of life, in the first few months of life, you have no concept of yourself at all. You have not developed it. You have to develop it gradually. So that phase is the phase of autoerotism, and is characterized by autoerotic activities. But let's say that the child, which is a couple of months old, through random movement gets his finger in his mouth and sucks. That's what he is at that point. That sensory experience is what he is at that point. Now, little bit by little bit, he will be adding all the sensory experiences and expanding the range of things that he experiences and consequently are me, right? And he'd be able to distinguish between these different things and put it in their place. But all of that takes a long time. While that is happening, he has, at the beginning, during the so-called phase of autoerotism, he has no idea. He has no self-concept. He has not developed a concept of a self. Through months, though, at some point, he will develop a very primitive concept of the self, but it's a concept of the self. So that the child now is not a series of different sensory experiences. For example, if he's hungry and he's fed, that's what he is. If he defecates or passes, urinates, that's what he is at that particular point in time. These two things are not necessarily related. You understand what I mean? Why? They are separated events, and what the child knows of himself is what he is experiencing at that particular point in time. Now, very regress psychotic patients are like that. That's a very primitive stage. Well, in any case, little bit by little bit, he starts to develop the idea, a primitive map of himself. When it is sufficiently developed, then what gets affected is the self, that primitive map. And anything that happens, like gratifying his hunger through his mouth, is now not an experience in itself, which is all he knows about himself, but it's an experience that takes place in that new map of the self that he has developed. In other words, now this different sensory experience belong into that map. They are not himself as they happen in isolation before he can build the map in which he can place them. Do you understand what I'm saying? Once he does that, he has reached, Freud will say, the stage of primary narcissism. He says something has to happen to move people out of the phase of autoerotism. And that thing that has to happen to move into the stage of primary narcissism is the development of a self, a body self, and a very primitive psychological self, right? Once that happens, then you are in the stage of primary narcissism. And now you are not different experience isolated from one another that you become as you experiencing them. Now all of these experiences are referred to that map that you have built. And that's the stage of primary narcissism. All right? Now, at that time, the child is in that phase of the omnipotence of thought and magic and all of that, because he still has the belief that he brings about the things by these different sensory experiences that he has and movement that he produces and engrams that he develops and, gestalts of that obviously light his brain in different places, and he's saying bring about the changes. So The primary narcissistic stage is a kind of self-sufficient stage, in inverted commas. It's not self-sufficient at all. What happens is that, of course, the mother is protecting the child, feeding the child, doing the things that she requires. And if she does that, then the child has a normal stage of primary narcissistic cathexis. In other words, he now values himself. He has a map of himself. He has put the different sensory experiences that were isolated from one another and had no map of the self to be referred to. Now there is a map of the self to which he can refer them, And so what is valued now is the self, not the autoerotic activity. You see what I mean, the difference? Now, during the primary narcissistic stage, most of the gratification is an autoerotic type, just as it was during the phase of autoerotism. The difference is that now has a reference to the self. Before there were a phenomena, isolated phenomena that were all that was known by the child, that sensory experience at the time that he was experiencing it. So, during that time of primary narcissism, if he is sufficiently protected and fed and stimulated and so on, his brain development will take place quite well and quite normally, because no system of that type is perfect. He will soon start to realize that it is not his magic that makes him what he believes he is, self-sufficient, that if he's hungry, all he has to do is cry and do his dance and song, and food will come. He, little bit by little bit, realized that doesn't work that way, fellow. There is something out there that has to come, which means he develops an idea of the objects out there. Now, they don't have name, they are not called mother, there is something out there that has to come to help him. The name of mother, father, brother, sister, whatever, comes much later, not at this particular point in time. Once he has developed that idea that something out there is important, now his attention goes from the self that was completely self-sufficient in this magic stage at the beginning to that thing out there that is required for him to restore his equilibrium. That's the beginning of object relationships, right? Now, he doesn't call that an object. He doesn't know it is his mother. But in reality, for an external observer like you and me, you will say that's the beginning of object relationships. Now, he's going. His cathexis are not all in the self. They are going out there. There is an interest in the world outside. So that's he's distributing his cathexis. That the beginning were in the different autoerotic activities during the phase of autoerotism, that's all there was, to the phase of primary narcissism, where there is a map where all these autoerotic activities are placed, and this is the mouse, and this is another part of his body, and so on. But they are referred to the self. They are not things independent of the self. So what is cathected is not the activity, but the whole self. And that's primary narcissism. Primary narcissism breaks down, obviously, because the brain continues to develop cognitively, and because, obviously, the magic that the child believed on at the beginning is not real and requires something out there to come and help him. Otherwise, he will die of hunger, Little bit by little bit, he becomes aware of that. Little bit by little bit, he starts to value that object more and more, and then object relationship develop. Finally, he will develop object constancy, and that object will become extraordinarily important to him and be the model for all object relationships later on. And from there, he will expand to other object relationships. Now, once that has happened, what the object does is important to him. The more, once he has developed object constancy, and the more that develops later on, his object relationships, then he's becoming, now the self is not any longer, like during the stage of primary narcissism, self-sufficient. In fact, he's dependent on the object. In other words, his investment of cathexis goes from the self to the object. All right? And he becomes object-related. If he can do that, which some people cannot sufficiently, then you are stuck at the stage of primary narcissism. And you have a very severe form of disturbance. And that's not a neurotic conflict, that's a developmental lag, and a very serious one. It doesn't have the structure of a neurotic conflict. Now, once you affect the object, and the object becomes important to you, the object then is what regulates your self-esteem. Before, you regulated it magically. Now, you know that you can do that you depend on these objects, and the object becomes more and more important. So, what you invested in the object is returned to you in the form of secondary narcissistic cathexis. The object sends you, return to you your investment, your capital investment in them, it pays you interest for it. And if it's kind and loves you and so on, you receive, you feel good. What before regulated your self-esteem by magical means and by cathexing the self, by thinking that the self was all there was to it and nothing else was necessary. Now you realize that the object world is important. All right? And the object world starts to regulate your self-esteem. And that's called secondary narcissistic cathexis. Now, neurotic problems are in that level. Once you become object-related, when the object is meaningful to you, and so on. That's where they start. All right? They are not strictly stuck in there because, as you know, we develop in such a way that at some point we introject these objects that are out there and on which we depend and make the superego out of it. And once we do that, we regulate our self-esteem, mostly by the relationship between our ego and our superego, which is a representative of the objects outside there. Okay? You still have some concern with the object, but as I told you the other day, a really well-developed, mature human being will function on the basis of the relationship between his ego and his superego, not what the external world thinks of him or what they think he should do. He will do what in good conscience his ego tells him to do and his superego approves of it. That's what he will do. Anything different from that will create a conflict between his ego and his superego, and he can't take it. He will have to tell people, I'm sorry, I like you very much, but I can't do what you want. You know? And that's, of course, somebody that has really become mature. So in the end, you have taken the objects from the outside that were regulating your self-regard, your feelings of self-worth, and your self-esteem, put them inside yourself. And that's where neurotic conflicts get organized. Now, remember, before you got there, you were going through the oral phase, the anal phase. The oral phase is during the first year of life. That is, during the phase of autoerotism, primary narcissism, and the beginning of the move of object cathexis to the object, or cathexis to the objects, from the self to the objects. Once you do that, you are distributing your cathexis between the self and the object. And the balance between the cathexis in the self and the cathexis on the object will determine whether you are a normal human being capable of reasonable normal object relationship, or you are a narcissistic character disorder, or has narcissistic pathology and are unable to cathect objects, at all. Indeed, you may look like you cathect objects, but you only cathect objects if they gratify your needs. Otherwise, you have no interest in them. You don't value the objects. Remember the difference between somebody who has reached object consciousness and somebody who is only functioning at the level of need satisfying, that will be during the primary narcissistic stage, essentially, is that the object is valued by the function that it performs in terms of gratifying the self, not by the object itself. While once you reach object consciousness, the function is not important. The object that performs the function is at least as important as the function that was performed by the object, at least temporarily, for a considerable amount of time. Forever, not generally. Then it will overwhelm the value of the object sooner or later. All right? But generally, in most normal people, the object be valued by itself, and even if the object cannot perform the functions that fulfill your needs and gratify your requirements, you still will be attached to the object. You won't abandon the object. You obviously will be sorry that you don't get the gratification that you used to, but you still value the object by itself. You are normal. You are a narcissistic character disorder. Forget it. The gratification of your needs is more important than the object. And so you will abandon the object very quickly, because you haven't really reached object consciousness. You are functioning at the level of need satisfaction, which essentially is in the primary narcissistic stage, So as you see, there is an overlap between the development of object relationship, the construction of a self, the knowledge with which you are born, what you think you are, which at the beginning is your different sensory experience. You are hungry, that's what you are. You don't know what else you are. Somebody touches you somewhere, that's what you are at that point. But it's not connected with your hunger or with your evacuation of the gastrocolic reflex. That takes time to build that map and say, well, when I put this in my mouth, something come at the other end, and all of that is part of me. You're building a map. Once you have enough of a map, that's a stage of primary narcissism. And that's Freud's requirement for primary narcissism.